Hi, everybody. My name is Bob Boland. I am a board member at Culture and Sports, but I'm also a professor at Seton Hall University Law School, and I hang my shingle out to practice law at the law firm Shoemaker, which is a sponsor of today's events. Culture and Sports has been one of my great privileges to be associated with in terms of writing and having an opportunity for thought leadership. It grows out of my having spent 5 years in one of the weirder roles in all of athletics as athletic integrity officer at Penn State and dealing from both a crisis but also responding to changes and new crises, whether that was legalized sports betting, whether that was changing standards in coaching interactions with athletes, whether that was NIL. And so we put this panel together to explore the differences that coaches face today in this new climate, a professionalizing climate, if not a fully professional one, where expectations run higher in certain places. And most of the panelists today are people who are in one sense 6 degrees of separation from me. And we're missing one of my favorites, Kyle Stark, who's a former vice president of the Pittsburgh Pirates, but he's also in Florida, and it looks like he may be without power right now. So he would have been the moderator, but I'm stepping in to pinch hit. But I'm going to throw to each of you, and I'll go off my screen right now. Wayne McDonnell, you are to my upper left. And you don't have to tell how we know each other, but or why you're here, but tell us a little bit about you.
Well, first and foremost, Bob, it's always great to see you, and thank you for letting me be on this panel with these amazing people. But Bob and I go back a very long time for our days at NYU. Well, we worked together for 15 years. But quick background, I'm currently at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I work in their sport administration program. I'm on the faculty. Very happy to be a member of that team. Well, I have a very unique position at Chapel Hill where I'm also a college baseball analyst on the ACC Network Extra. So not only am I working, advising student athletes, teaching student athletes, I'm broadcasting them, and the conversations are very unique. We go from, baseball mechanics to coaching changes and philosophies. So just very lucky in the role that I have. On top of that, I'm a Forbes Sports Money contributor, like Dr. Weaver from the previous panel. And both Bob and I have contributed chapters to our upcoming second edition Sport Finance book. So I'm just very happy to be here and looking forward to a great conversation.
I'm going to go to the opposite side of my screen. Dr. Patty Robbie Keller. Tell us who you are, Patty, and you, again, don't have to say how we know each other, but you hired me to teach a class at one point.
Thank you. I'm currently the director of the Masters in Sports Administration program at Boston College. It's a newer program, and our program is pretty unique in that all my faculty work in the sports industry. They are not research faculty. They're not sitting in the office at BC hanging out. They're doing their job, and they come in and teach our class. Many of our students are interning some at their locations and other places they have connections with. Bob and I have known each other for a while, but when I took the job, NLI just hit. So I said to Bob and his colleague Tuma, I said, we need a class on name, image, likeness. So we put together a class 3 years ago on name, image, likeness. It's been reiterated many times. I just sat with Tuma the other day and redid a lot of things, but we're probably one of the only programs in the country that have a class on that. And then I make that available. Like, I have parents taking this class. We let other people who have an undergrad degree take the class. But it's pretty interesting. I work hand in hand with our collective at Boston College. I have students interning with them. Many of my current students some of them are like assistant coaches and athletic staff in the athletics department. Some are student athletes. Then I just have students I've recruited from all over the world in our program. But one of the projects that our students have done is work with our collective and work with the athletics department. And they've made like a one pager for our coaches when they go out to recruit, because we're not Alabama, we're Boston College. So try to explain to our current recruits coming in what we do for name, image, and likeness for our student athletes. We don't have all the bells and whistles that some of our bigger school counterpoints have, but we do a lot of different things with service. and some other things that our student athletes really buy in on. One of my student athletes worked with our women's basketball, or one of my students worked with our women's basketball players last year, and many of them are African American, and she specifically worked on their needs. So they all have a hair deal with a stylist in town, and they get their nails done, some unique things like that. But I'm coming from working in every level of college athletics. I've worked Division 2, 1, and 3, and junior college. I'm a former two-sport Division 3 athlete. I'm married to a former NFL football player, Division 1 football coach, strength coach. We have a 15-year-old daughter who's now ranked #1 in the state of Massachusetts in ACES for volleyball. So we're going through the whole recruiting process, name, image, and likeness. She's also Miss Teen Shrewsbury where we live. So I'm seeing it as a faculty member, but I'm living it through my child right now. Like, who knew that a car dealership might want her like as part of their thing? So, and that unique relationship, that power that she might have here coming in as a recruit is pretty scary. So that's where I'm coming from on this, and I appreciate being here.
Patty, we're thrilled to have you. I didn't have to prompt you to give the other part of your bio, and I know how proud you are of your daughter. Scott, I'm meeting you for the first time today, but I'm thrilled to get to know you, and I'm very impressed by your work in a variety of ways, which I hope you'll talk about with us today. Scott, or Chris, sorry, I told you Scott. I apologize, Chris. Dr. Chris Barnhill, yes, I apologize. My fault.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, I'm Chris Barnhill. I'm an associate professor at Belmont University. Been a professor now for 15 years at various schools. But before I was in academia, I worked in college athletics at both East Tennessee State and Kansas State, and actually was spurred to get my PhD to go in to teach people how to navigate this industry. My dissertation back in the day was looking at the relationships between coaches and athletes and how those formed during recruiting, back when we weren't allowed to make any monetary promises. Wink, wink. And so come full circle now, and as you see, these relationships continue to get more and more complex, and there's more and more to learn there. And then here at Belmont, I teach our leadership classes, and so we have quite a bit of discussion on what is happening in the world right now. And so college athletics always seems to give us a lot to discuss.
Thanks so much. Thank you very, very much, Chris. And Craig, let's come to you.
Thanks, Bob, for having me. And Bob and I go back, I think, about 18 years. Bob made the mistake of hiring me for a couple of years at NYU, and he's the one that got me started as a professor. So I do feel a sense of gratitude, because this is a job that I love. This is basically my third career. My first career, I was a basketball coach, and I was a basketball coach for 25 years. I was a AAU coach for a year. I was a high school assistant coach for a year in Washington, D.C. And then I was a grad assistant while I was in law school at Georgetown, full-time assistant for 17 years, and then the head coach at Georgetown in between the two Thompsons between 1999 and 2004. Boston College was one of our rivals back in the Big East before they became traitorous and left to the ACC, Patty. And I also have a third career. I'm a color commentator during college basketball season, and I've been doing that for 16 years. And on the side, while I've been a professor at George Mason, I've also worked for the U.S. Department of State as a sport diplomat. We managed a sport visitors grant for 8 years, and I've been a sports envoy for the State Department. They sent me to 2 countries that I bet nobody on this panel has ever been to. One is Azerbaijan, and the other is Mauritania. And I tell my students sometimes that I was a sports envoy to Mauritania, and they invariably say, well, how was Morocco? I said, no. Morocco is a different country on the same coast, but it's been a great second career. I love teaching, and Bob, I have you to thank for it.
Well, we're going to tap all your careers a little bit, although your knowledge of African geography and Mauritania is very helpful, at least for this point. Jeff, I think we can say that I've known you the longest, and you started responsible for launching my career. But you are the coach's coach and the athletic administrator's administrator in my world. So tell us a little bit about you, and let's talk. We'll jump right into some questions.
Okay, Bob, I feel a little intimidated as I look at the rest of the panel, but we have known each other the longest. I will simply say that we shared an apartment in 1982 and not tell the whole story. I was, at that point, I was a swim coach. I was the swim coach, women's swimming coach at Columbia. I had the unique experience of going to Dartmouth the year after it went co-ed, going to West Point as an assistant coach the year it went co-ed, and then going to Columbia to be the head women's swimming coach the year before it went co-ed. I then went to Brown and was an assistant athletic director at Brown. Then I went to Bowdoin, was athletic director at Bowdoin for 14 years. Then I went to Asphalt Green, which was a big public-private partnership in New York City that probably could only exist in New York City. We had about 30,000 people in our program, and then went to Brandeis as interim athletic director when they had some issues in their athletic department. Then I retired and was going crazy. So for the last 4 years, I went back to coaching swimming, and I coach 9 to 12-year-olds. So hopefully I learned more about coaching as an administrator than I forgot about swimming.
Jeff, your life story sort of explains exactly how I think most coaches are. And coaches tend to fall into the category of loving what they do and would do it if there wasn't compensation. I represent some of the ones who do it for a lot of compensation in my day job or in one of my 2 day jobs. But as the athletes have pushed for greater rights, for a greater say in what they do, particularly in the college experience, are we in a fundamentally different place for coaches? And that's open for everybody. Please feel free to jump on that. And how has coaching changed in the current environment?
So first of all, I think you got to figure out which coaches you're talking about. So, Nil probably doesn't have a huge impact for the coaches that I worked with at Bowdoin. Okay. But for the places where Nil is more prevalent, for me, as I think about it, it simply makes the job more complex and requires one to have skills and knowledge that aren't necessarily fundamental to coaching and the sport. And I've seen there's some parallels to the degree to which coaches now have to engage in fundraising, where they're doing a bunch of stuff that they didn't know that they were going to get into. And I've seen a lot of tensions in that. I actually believe that the core coaching experience isn't different. It's just more complex, if that makes sense.
I've also made a small mistake. I realized that our host, Jeremy, is here. And I forgot that Jeremy is also a pretty extraordinary coach, having created the Afghan water polo program while he served in the Marine Corps in Afghanistan. And I'm going to not just treat Jeremy as our host, but I'm going to call on him in this panel and ask him to share some thoughts with us. So I apologize to Jeremy, who is responsible for all of this, but very happy that I remembered that Jeremy is not just our master of ceremonies and host, but he's also a panelist. Jeremy, why don't really skilled swimming coach, really skilled water polo coach, great hero. Have you created culture in sports to deal with this? How are you intuiting that culture in sports is, and you've coached in a variety of settings? How are you intuiting that culture in sports or sports coaching has changed and is under different pressure?
So I think that for some coaches it has changed, right? I would have to make an assumption here with Jeff with his long coaching experience that he probably has always had stakeholders in his programs and in his organizations, whether it's coaches or athletes or support staff or everyone else. And with athletes are an equal member of the team, right? So we all have our roles, whether you're in a company or in in higher education or in a sports program, whatever the case may be. Every person has their role, and with that role is athletes are stakeholders. So I think the athletes have always been there. I think a fair number of coaches have always treated the athletes as shareholders. And so I think it is a forcing function now where coaches who weren't treating their athletes as shareholders or stakeholders within an organization are now having to change not only how they coach but also internally reflect with how they're coaching as well.
Craig, I want to throw it to you in some measure here, because the arc of your coaching career really coincides with one of the great run-ups in college sports. The idea that the Big East was an idea in germination when you began coaching in small gyms, and by the end of your career, it was a nationally televised product with a $40 million contract annually coming out of this, or is today at that level. Where are you? Where do you put the arc of this, and how many more people are in the gym now than were at the beginning when you started?
Well, I do think that the Big East, along with the establishment of ESPN, was great synergy in terms of our league and in terms of popularizing a lot of teams that were in our league at the time. I think back to when I was coaching, and I just wrote down some notes in terms of some of the things that we didn't have to work with. Social media was not around at the time. No such thing as email, internet when I was coaching until near the very end of my coaching career. No such thing as NIL. And I will say that at many schools, it's not really name, image, and likeness anymore. It's pay to play. There was no such thing as the transfer portal. In fact, you got penalized if you transfer from one school to the other. And the other thing that I think is a big problem for both coaches, mental and physical health, and also the players, is there's no such thing as an off season. And that's true of a lot of sports. It's not just men's and women's college basketball, but coaches used to get married in May or August because that was the downtime in college basketball. I got married in August. And, now these coaches, and it doesn't matter where you are, they're working 12 months out of the year. If they're not recruiting high school kids, they're recruiting kids in the portal. And I'm wondering, why even recruit high school kids now? Because you have a much better idea about what a kid's going to do if he's in the transfer portal, because you've seen video of him playing against college players. So it's completely different. I will tell you, I don't like it. I would have had to adjust, obviously, and every coach does have to adjust. I don't want, if my two kids were playing college sports, they're both out of college now, but if they're playing college sports, or if they're in a classroom with a professor at college, I want them to know who's in charge. And I understand what Jeremy's saying in terms of giving stakeholders, some form of say in terms of what's going on. I'm giving an exam today at 3:00. I didn't ask my students what do they want on the exam. I'm the one that's supposed to be the expert in sport management, and so I think that the pendulum, clearly things have changed, no question about it. And again, coaches have to adjust, and I would have adjusted, but it doesn't mean that you have to like it or think it's the best way to run a business.
Chris, I'm gonna come to you on this one because you actually, and it's something that I learned in my job, in that weird job as athletic integrity officer, talking to coaches, that a lot of times there are some unique aspects of sport and there are some unique aspects of the coaching relationship that are a little bit out of time and out of sequence for the rest of the world today. And you've talked about empathy in sports and kind of a radical understanding of the other person's prerogative. Doesn't mean you actually have to accept it. You just have to have some understanding of it. Can you talk about the tools from your research that a coach today should have in dealing with all the people that might be in the room that Craig talked about, that the things they didn't have to deal with, or Jeff sort of said that at some levels they're not too different? Can you talk about just some of those new people in the room?
Sure.
And how they need to have weapons or skills, I guess, is the key.
Sure. Empathy all comes down to understanding the other person. It's communication, it's listening, it's getting to know what drives the other person, what their experiences have been in life, what they're bringing to the relationship, what their perspective is. Obviously, the main relationship with all those people in the room is still the coach and the athlete. And Craig made a great point about how he wouldn't recruit high school students anymore. He'd recruit college athletes because of the transfer portal, right? Those relationships were built, and when I was first studying this, they were built during that recruiting process. And that's a challenging time for a coach, because you're trying to sell an athlete, trying to be truthful, but you're also not trying to, be so truthful that you violate the sale, and so to speak, and run the student athlete off, right? So there's a lot of untold parts that the student athlete then has to figure out for themselves and try to interpret what you mean. That recruiting relationship doesn't end that. You're constantly recruiting, and you have a lot more people in the room who are influencing what that athlete's hearing, what their perspectives are. And so from a coaching perspective, and the term we used when I first started looking at this was the psychological contract, the unwritten contract that actually governs the relationship, right? The implied relationship between two people. And so it starts during that time. We're trying to get that person interested in coming, get that athlete interested in coming. We're trying to be as honest as possible, but not lose the sale, so to speak. And now we have more and more people who are influencing what that athlete might want, and it creates just a really complex relationship. And complexity does give an opportunity for you to build a stronger relationship with people, but it also opens up the opportunity for more misunderstanding. And so all of that.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, based on that opportunity for misunderstanding and the idea that coaches are re-recruiting, how much of that is done in terms of actual conversation, and how much of that might be done in the overall culture of the program? And I guess it depends on the athlete, but which one is more important, a greater hallmark? The things you say to the athlete individually, or the things that your program stands for?
There's a lot more communication that happens non-verbally than ever happens verbally. And think about a football team, for example. You might have 100 people on the team. You don't get a lot of time for one-on-one conversations with those 100 people. So that student athlete, that athlete on your team, is looking at the culture, looking at how you interact with others, looking at do they perceive you fulfilling promises that were made to others. And so, they can look at an athlete on a team who says, "I'm leaving. You didn't come through on the NIL promise made to me," and instantly, they weren't part of that. But now they look at that and see, well, is the coach going to come through on the promises made to me now, right? And so that culture and really trying to understand what's going on in the locker room with the team and with the internal workings of the others is so much more important than that one-on-one conversation. And that's happening all the time. And that's the hard part for a coach is that communication is happening maybe when you're not in the room. That communication is happening when you walk to the room. That communication is happening at practice. That communication is happening during the game. And it may be you two just standing next to each other, and that student athlete might be reading the body language when you walk by them to see what you think of them. So from a standpoint, we really need to be aware of the culture we're creating, and also be aware of what the communicating we're doing when we're not speaking, I guess is a good way to put it.
That's an amazing statement to articulate a whole new area of development and intelligence a coach has to have. Wayne, you're watching this from a broadcast booth. You're looking at programs from a network perspective. You've obviously studied this stuff and you've coached in the world. Tell me what you're seeing out there in the relationship between players and coaches and across the transfer world that you're transforming college baseball or transforming other aspects of college in a major program.
I completely agree with Chris. It's all culture. In my short time in Chapel Hill, I've seen some major coaching changes where legendary coaches have stepped aside. I sit next to Coach Fox in the broadcast booth, and I joke with him all the time saying, your name's on the building. And the one thing that I can say, whether it's field hockey with Erin Matson coaching now, or baseball with Scott Forbes coaching, or Anson Dorrance stepping down in soccer, all of those programs have continued with high levels of success because of culture. And the one thing it was the trust. And, transfer portal's big. I could say with great certainty that student athletes are in my office almost every day talking about it, kind of weighing it through. But in particular with the sports where there's such a strong culture, student athletes are willing to wait it out and kind of see where it's going. And I've noticed that in particular with field hockey. Coach Shelton stepped down and the transition went to Coach Matson. And there was a lot of concern because of the age of Coach Matson and everything, but everyone believed in the culture. And that's the big thing for me, because going back to Craig's point, which I totally agree with from what I'm seeing from the broadcast booth and the conversations that I'm having with coaches in the ACC, it goes back to the whole thought process. We're going to go into the transfer portal. We know what these student athletes are. We know their abilities. We have video on them. We have these conversations. And some of them have even said, you know what, going after high school players might not be the thing I'm going to do right now. I'm going to go right to the portal because there's such a pressure to win now. And some schools have become pipelines. For instance, in baseball, the Ivy Leagues have been a pipeline for Duke in terms of the transfer portal. And certain schools we know, like Liberty, has become a pipeline for North Carolina. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics, but I completely agree with Craig, and I completely agree with what Chris had said with regard to culture.
Patty, you're experiencing this through your daughter now. You've experienced it as an athlete and administrator. How much harder is it to be a coach today in this world?
You are their financial advisor, you are their counselor, you are everything to these kids. Some of our coaches are not equipped to be everything to these kids. They don't have that emotional capacity, the empathy that, Chris talked about. They're there to do the X's and O's, and smart coaches, they find good assistant coaches that can fill these roles. And, so there's someone there for every kid for the things that they need. Even our strength coaches, my husband was a strength coach for a long time. They're with our student athletes all year long. They probably have some of the strongest relationships with our football and our basketball players. I've been doing work with our strength coaches at BC on QPR issues and challenges their student athletes face, because they're face fronting with those student athletes every day, 365 days of the year, right? So they're telling them, you need to go see your academic advisor, you need to go see the mental health counselor, you need to go find a financial advisor, all those things. And then many of our strength coaches, unless you're doing football, you're making $30,000 a year. So then you're working with student athletes who are making gobs of money. And our coaching staffs, our younger ones, our athletic trainers, all our support staff are barely making what first year teachers pay. And that's educating the student athletes also on that disparity as well, has been very eye-opening to some of our student athletes.
Are we seeing
yes.
burnout in those coaches?
Oh, absolutely. My husband had a heart attack coaching. I mean, he was in a coma for 6 days. So yes, you see those, they're coming to me, they want to get their master's. How can I transition into a different role? Some of them even talked about, I feel like a lot of mental health counseling in my role as a strength coach. I would like to transition more into that role where it's not the 4 a.m. meetings they're having, so they can have a life, they can be with their children, maybe get married, things like that. So you do see even coaches now are reaching out to me because I worked in college athletics for 20 years. They're like, how did you make the change into academia where you have a better work-life balance? You're seeing it all the time. And there's so many hats that coaches have to wear. They can't wear them all.
That's a great point. I want to go into a kind of a rip from the headlines moment, and I want to get anybody's reaction. I'm not gonna call on anybody. I want you to react in real time to it. It's been big news. It's the case at UNLV involving Matthew Sluka, quarterback of a 3-0 team who had transferred in as a graduate transfer, who did not get the money he was promised. We don't have a lot of division on the facts here. There may be some undercurrents one way or the other. I am a little surprised that the head coach sort of admitted an NCAA bylaw violation, was happier to talk about that than to say that the player hadn't gotten his commitment or something else. But can you react to that and talk about that situation from a coach's angle and a coach's perspective?
So the first thing is none of us were there, right? We weren't there between the conversation between the potential athlete who is in the transfer portal and the coaches. But we'll just say for a minute that this assistant coach who the athlete thought had the authority to say that there could be a money deal or that there would be promised a money deal, then the coaching staff and the school need to follow through with that, or coaching staff, the NIL collective, and the school need to follow through with whatever the coach said that they were going to do. And if the coach did not have the authority to do it, then why is the coach offering that? And kind of going back on what I was saying earlier is everyone plays a role, everyone's a stakeholder. And in this case, the coach is the one who's offering this. It's not another athlete. It's not the support staff. It's not the hot dog vendor at the stadium on game day. It's the coach who has the position of authority, and what that coach says has to be taken as the truth by the athletes, right? So if that's what's being offered, that's what the coaches need to come through with. And from everything that I've read or seen, is the coaches were just very, the coaches in the NIL collective were very quiet about it, and were not, directly answering the athlete. And I think that's ultimately what led the athlete to leave. Not necessarily that he wasn't paid, but they were probably gaslighting him or just ignoring him and ignoring his questions, which then probably turned into demands. And then the athlete is like, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to jump in on that one? Go ahead.
I'll build on that. I actually had written that one down as an example. Again, like Jeremy said, none of us are in the room. We don't know what was said, right? And often there's two people in the room who will disagree on what was said, even though they were the only two people there. Sometimes the communication isn't clear. Maybe the assistant coach insinuated some things without saying and led the student athlete to believe something. Maybe the student athlete read something into something else. Maybe there was a flat out promise made. We don't know. But then you get into it, the best policy in this case is being clear. Talking it through, right? If something was promised, then the school needs to find a way to come through on it. I know that's a challenge with NCAA rules, NIL rules, and all the vagueness that we're dealing with right now. But along those same lines, if things or situations are left to fester where the communication is not clear, then it lets stuff build up in people's heads. I thought I was promised this. I was promised this. They're not talking to me. They're pulling back away from me. They must not be wanting to come through with this. And it's just allows a situation to spiral out of control. And now the problem UNLV has and that coaching staff has is every other member of that team who may or may not have believed promises were made are now a little bit more aware of what was said when, or what they thought was said during their recruiting process. And I think NIL just brings in that extra challenge because you have third parties also involved who aren't in the room when all this is brought up as well.
And third parties with incentive in some cases not to pay. Wayne, go ahead.
One of the things I always find interesting, as all of us who are faculty members, in sport administration at the undergraduate and graduate levels, and in law school, we talk about accountability and responsibility in leadership positions within sports, and we expect that of our student athletes. We hold them to the highest of standards at a very challenging time for them, particularly with social emotional competencies and mental health. And in the previous panel, seeing how you're managing the landscape of what House versus the NCAA is going to do to their worlds. And I find it sometimes very hypocritical that we're holding the student athlete to the highest of standards and we're preaching accountability and responsibility. And then we see something what happened at UNLV where there's a lot of finger pointing. Oh, I didn't say this, but this one said that. And what message are we sending? Because we're upholding the academic integrity and really trying to instill these principles in the student athletes at a very precarious time when the leaders who are the coaches should be also instilling accountability and responsibility in them, but they're having a hard time doing it because of all the changes that's going on in college athletics right now.
Craig, you are the other member of this panel like me who's a lawyer too. Even if you try to avoid that as much as you can.
Don't tell anybody.
Don't tell anybody. You don't tell anybody. But you admit to having gone to law school and studied this. And
unfortunately, I'm married to a lawyer too, so that's a big problem.
It's hard for you to get away from that.
Yeah.
But we know as lawyers about certain things about enforcing oral agreements or enforcing contracts, and we're also recognizing we're in a new world. Do coaches need to have a little bit more in the toolbox in terms of this current NIL world and the promises they make? And maybe has recruiting shifted in a way?
Absolutely. And I think that, just as, your husband or wife needs to trust you, your kids need to trust you, your players need to trust you. I mean, that relationship with your players, with your assistant coaches is important, and trust is very important. And if that coach, whether he was an assistant or the head coach, violated the trust in the most important position in football, which is quarterback, then, shame on that guy. And I totally understand why the quarterback would leave. I looked at the box score the very next game, and I have a theory about this in terms of the $100,000. The very next game after the guy left, they scored 59 points. UNLV scored 59 points against Fresno. And the quarterback that took this guy's place ran, I think, for 120 yards and threw for 250 yards. Maybe that's where some of the $100,000 went, is the backup quarterback. But if trust was violated, that's a problem. And that was a problem before NIL too. You got to be able to trust your coach. You go to a school because you think you can trust your coach. And if that was violated at a very basic level, then that's a problem.
I think
whether he should have signed a written contract or not, Bob, that I get the legal part of it, but that relationship with the coach, the trust is a pretty big deal.
And probably the paramount thing at the end of the day, in the relationship, that you're here for the specific promises I'm making to you. I've heard a lot of coaches, and I've actually had a case where I was successful in getting the athlete as promised NIL after his career was over, but I also threatened the coach at that point with suing him for fraud, and in a case that already included the NCAA. So I had a little bit of a hammer in that I was prepared to make him famous. but yeah, I found everybody being a little recalcitrant about their responsibility, that the school had no responsibility, the collective had no responsibility, and coach had no further responsibility. And my answer was, I don't really care which of you is responsible. One of you will be, and I'll make sure that you're all going to be joined as defendants. And have a really nice day. I'm sure I'm not going to be very popular at that school going forward, but I think we did get the player what he deserved and gave him a future that is again a helpful one. I almost look at the UNLV situation this way. I know that the backup may have been pressing for time. I know from a number of schools that we've overcompensated players who've been free agents to a degree out there, whose performance isn't as good as we'd like. And a lot of collectives are trying to play very fast and loose, whether they want to go to monthly contracts so they can reduce the amount that's going in this pay-to-play environment. Are there any guardrails that could be put in place to fix this and make it better for coaches?
Leadership.
I was a compliance officer for a long time, and student athletes sign their national letter of intent. And when I started, it was for 1 year, and then as I got older, it went for 2 or 3 years. Honestly, as a parent now that has a kid that could be signing a national letter of intent to play in 2 years, and then getting promised some things, volleyball is getting super popular in college sports. I want in writing what she's going to get. I want that there should be something, a trigger there, a mechanism that this is what she's going to get when she signs. This is what she's going to get after her freshman year. And can you renegotiate after so many things? I think that, the implied consent, the verbal oral contract, there needs to be something in writing to protect not only the student athlete, but the school and the coaches. And then there's no ambiguity what you're getting. And then that should be, I think for state schools, it's going to be made public, right? This is what student athletes are getting. This is what their compensation is. I work at Boston College. It's very under the veil. I see your quarterback driving a car that probably costs more than my house and has a dog that probably costs about $25,000. We see that, right? But we're not always sure what everyone's getting. And, does the third string quarterback, is he entitled to the same thing as the starting quarterback? Yes or no? So I think that's something that's going to have to come down the pike here soon, where they're, the management council, the NCAA presidents are going to have to vote it in. The NCAA just can't make it happen. That's not how the NCAA works. So we're going to have to see.
I was very lucky to have worked in a Big Ten institution, and the Big Ten had a couple of really good rules, but one of them was that your financial aid could not go down from your first offer over your course of your time in school, barring a separately adjudicated misconduct in situation or a failure to maintain academic eligibility. I thought that was a really good rule because it to some degree kept that in place. That didn't obviate a better offer in NIL, but it was at least something that was interesting. Jeff, I've left you sitting quietly by, and I want to pick your brain on a couple of issues. And others can kind of jump into this one. Craig, with all due respect to you, Jeff is the most diligent recruiter I've ever met. I remember sitting at dinner once with the coach from the University of Miami, the coach from Ohio State, and Jeff talking about recruiting. And I was privy to this as a youngster, kind of coming up into the college space. And the coach at Ohio State said, I talked to 500 women over the course of the year. Jeff said, I talked to 5,000 women over the course of the year. And the coach at Miami said, I talked to 3 girls my first year, and none of them came. So everybody had a slightly different perspective. And Craig, I know you obviously have recruited at a high level, but would a recruiting pitch for a coach change now when NIL might not be on the table for that athlete going in, but might be later? And how would you change how you talk to athletes in this moment about what's valuable, what's important, and what culture is? And you're on mute.
So it was interesting when I was listening to Chris and Jeremy, and I was thinking about the fact that maybe an unintended consequence of this is that coaches are really forced to be more honest up front, and to less shade what their conversations are with student athletes. I will say that I actually, early in my coaching career, I, with regard to the intensity of our program, I probably wasn't as direct. I wasn't as direct as I should have been, and that was a mistake. Okay, so I needed to sell who we were rather than who I thought they wanted us to be, because inevitably there were big issues if I didn't do that. It goes back to that. Another way to say what I was trying to say earlier is that, like, coaching has been, the most effective coaches have always been transformational rather than transactional. I loved that quote from Nick Saban. I don't think that that's new. I think with NIL and the transfer portal and everything, it's more complicated. The importance of culture is not new. It will be really interesting for me at North Carolina in their field hockey program. Can she maintain the culture over time? I think when you're talking about NIL or opportunities down the line, it's very parallel to me to the scholarship offer where the coach says, hey, listen, we'll give you books this year, but if you're a starter in 2 years, it'll go up to X. I think if you're vague in that, you're creating problems. And if you're going to offer those as incentives, which I'm not actually sure is legal currently within the NCAA, that the coach would be offering those as an incentives, then if you promise something, you better deliver. Because every time you don't do that, you undermine your relationship with the kid. And when you undermine the relationship with the kid and it's money, that's bad. So
Jeff, you when you say that, I laugh because I remember how you used to describe the Columbia pool to prospective athletes, that it's not the best pool, it's not the worst pool, it won't make your decision for you. There are other reasons we make that decision. Jeff, I want to stay with you, but I want to bring in Craig, and I want to bring in Patty on this one, and then anybody else who wants to jump in. You've had to evaluate coaches, and you've had to fire coaches during the course of your career. Would that evaluation change now? And would the conversation about terminating a coach change? Or do you think it should or shouldn't? Where do you come down on that one? How do we evaluate coaches? How do we teach them to be better coaches? And how might we, what's the criteria for firing them? Jeff, I'll start with you, and we'll get Patty and Craig in if we can.
I thought about the conversation between the head coach and the quarterback at UNLV. When you're managing people, if they didn't communicate very well, that's bad. That coach has failed as part of their job. If they lied to me, that's really bad. As an athletic director or someone supervising coaches, making sure that those values are clear, and then having a way to be able to evaluate and see what's really happening is really important. And I think also as an athletic director, having the courage to have conversations about some of those issues early on before they become compounded is really important. I think about some of the coaches that I think have been fired recently. for bullying, or lack of a better word. And I think that, you know, their supervisors knew their behavior a long time ago, or they should have. And I wonder if they stepped in to talk with them about it. So.
Oh, well, I think that anybody today has to absolutely be aware that if your administrators aren't reading the evaluations of your coaches, lawyers like me are. So that's where we start. So it's one of the more important pieces. Craig and Patty, want to give you each a shot on this one. Do you evaluate or talk to coaches differently in the current environment? Should the decision to keep a coach or let a coach go be changed by kind of the modern times?
I think it's very similar to before NIL. You got to set expectations, and certainly at Georgetown, Boston College, North Carolina, Belmont's men's basketball program, you have to win, but you have to tell the coach when you hire the coach, what does this win? What does it actually mean? If the coach reaches a certain level in terms of winning, and all of a sudden may have one bad year or two, I'm not certain if it's fair. But if you've had a couple bad years, then coaches know that going in also, that you just have to, I think, be honest with the coach and set expectations at the very beginning. And winning certainly is part of this enterprise we're all in.
Patty, how about you?
Sure. I mean, from Division I all the way down to Division III, winning is important, but you also have to look at what is winning, is your definition of winning. When I was at a Division II school, the athletic director and I was the SWA, our definition of winning meant A, B, C, and D. And I had a coach there that was meeting all those expectations. The AD and I both left, and the new AD came in, and that coach kept doing what he was doing, but the AD's definition of winning was different, and he let him go. Right? So you have to be, and he never had that conversation with the coaches when the AD came in saying, well, this is my definition of winning, right? So then the coaches didn't know that, well, I need to change what I'm doing to meet that AD's expectations. And then you can win all day on numbers, wins and losses, but if you're not winning with your student athletes, if you're not treating them well, if you're not treating the athletic staff well, if you're not doing all those things, are you really winning? So we've had issues in the past of coaches' misconduct, bullying staff members, bullying student athletes, bullying their own assistant coaches, things like that, where yes, in the public eye, they're winning, but in the athletic department, they're not. So how do you even publicly say, how you're going to let them go? Those kind of things happen as well. So there's a very, slippery slope in that. And then there's things that happen that you're going to let the coach go. Do you want to ruin their career? How do you make it public why you're letting them go? They didn't do anything wrong. They just didn't meet what you wanted. So there's all those things in there as well.
Patty, that's great. I love the idea of that. I brought up the idea that coaching is still one of the areas where power and that power dynamic still shows up. And for Chris and Wayne, as academics, as people who watch this, who look for best practice, are there ways to moderate that use of power that we see in sports that we kind of reject from the old days? And what are the more effective ways to approach some of these problems?
I think it's communication. The programs that I have seen, particularly at Chapel Hill, that have done very well. And going back to Patty's point, it's not just on the court, pitch, field, or ice. It's in the classroom. It's in the community. It's the programs where the coaches preach accountability, responsibility, collaboration, communication, self-awareness, and realizing that I'm not going to have all of the answers, that I'm going to have to go out and build a support team. I was speaking with an agent the other day. We had some exhibition baseball games on campus, and he said to me flat out, given the whole different dynamics, don't be surprised if college athletics takes the professional sports model where teams start hiring general managers to try to help navigate some of the different things. But for me, it goes back to the success, to Patty's point, is the collaboration, the communication, the self-awareness, and teaching it that it goes beyond winning at times, and winning manifests itself in a variety of different ways.
Chris, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that based on your research and your work.
Yeah, when you have power, you have a couple options to go with that. You can pursue your own interests, or you can build other people up, right? And as much as we are professionalizing college athletics, it's still part of an educational enterprise, and so we are still in the business of building others, right? And so I think that's one of the things that is a challenge, because to get to the top of your industry, you're obviously a very ambitious person. You have had to have a lot of success to become a coach at a Division I level, and there is a path where you can get there by abusing your power and have short-term success, right? Now, long-term success, and I love that Coach Saban's comments were brought up. Long-term success does not come that way, right? Long-term success comes when you build others up. And I know for a long time, Coach Saban, from the outside world, you see him acting like many coaches on the sideline. We say, okay, that's kind of psychotic, and who would act like that? But you always hear his athletes talk about how much they love Coach Saban, which means he has a good, off the field, that relationship is very strong. He is building those others up. And so I think that's really important, is what is my ambition here? Is it to just purely serve myself, or is it to serve the people I brought in here? And speaking to one other point, we were talking about firing coaches, and I think the same thing with athlete, the coach-athlete relationship, the coach or athletic director-coach relationship. If you're in a position of power, your actions should never be surprising to those you're leading. They should see it coming. They should understand the expectations. And so if you're letting someone go and they're surprised by the move, that means there was a breakdown on your end, because you did not communicate your expectations clearly. And so, I think that's something that we could probably do a better job of earlier on with young coaches. A lot of people start at GAs and usually don't jump. I know it happened at North Carolina with field hockey, but usually you don't jump from being a player to a head coach of a successful program right away. And there's a lot of mentoring that happens with young coaches, and I think that needs to be a part of it. Is how do you communicate with people? How do you build relationships with others, and teach about that importance of long-term success through building others up versus selfish ambition.
Well, thank you so much. Those are perfect thoughts. I want to thank our panelists. I wish I could stay another hour or two with each of you and talk to you in greater detail about your experience and your views. It seems like, from my perspective, particularly out representing coaches, that some of the changes have hit coaches as a shock, and some of the coaches who've been most exposed are ones who are sort of operating as they were, but suddenly now have transfer students in who don't know the culture, who are finding this coach very unexpected and running into some problems. And then also there are the same problems of players who've transferred 5 and 6 times probably aren't the most reliable people you want to start with to build off your program. So I see that. Jeremy, I want to come to you for a last word, because you, as a coach, did the most extraordinary thing. You restarted a sport in a country where it had been unknown. You brought people in from different ethnicities and tribes and different religions, and brought them together on a national stage, then an international stage. And you did that pretty quickly and in a sideline that wasn't your main job. Can you talk a little bit, just for about the last 2 minutes that we have, about just the experience that you learned coaching in an entirely new environment with reestablishing the Afghan water polo team? And you've got to make it quick, because you're going to call time on me anyway.
The biggest thing is my adaptability as a leader, because I was never in a position where I was building sport on a regional or a national level. And so I had to adapt real quick with how I led and what my own expectations were, not only of myself, but of how we were going to build this program. And I had to rely on many other experts. And that's why I actually look at this similar to where, college coaches are today, is everything wasn't perfectly set up for you before, as they were before. So before, you had students that were, or athletes that were always going to be there for 4 years or 5 years. If they didn't, they would have to go through this long, convoluted process of how to transfer. Now people have the ability to leave immediately, right? And so that's how it is building sports in a third world war torn country. Back when I was, is that people could come and go not only when they wanted to, but also because of circumstances, right? And so I had to know that I had to do my best as a leader and as a coach to do everything possible to get those athletes to practice and to keep them engaged in what we were doing and have them trust and have great lines of communication. And those are things that coaches have to continuously do. And it's not as protective as coaches as it used to be. And I think it's actually a great new exciting time for coaches. And I think you're going to see so many coaches to continue to excel beyond what anyone ever thought, because it just shows what they're truly capable of as coaches.
Well, I can't think of it. It is obviously a daunting time for coaches right now, a challenging one. And as you say, adaptability, emotional intelligence, communication, and culture still are predominant and important, and probably even more amplified. Can't thank my guests enough. Wayne, Chris, Patty, Jeff, Craig, and obviously Jeremy, our leader here at Culture and Sports. Thank you for this time. We're gonna end this session, and we're moving on to another one, looking at the role of parents and athletes in this space, a subject we didn't even cover. And I know coaches all have a little bit of gray hair from that. So thank you, and we'll wish you the best. And I can't thank our guests enough. Thank you.
Thanks.
Ben.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Bob.
Bob. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy.